I am Dr. Claire Higgins. I'm a reader at Imperial College London in the Department of Bioengineering, which is the UK equivalent of a professor. And I run the skin regeneration laboratory at Imperial. So in my lab, we have 11 individuals. There's 4 postdocs and 7 PhD students, and they all work on projects associated with skin and hair follicle regeneration after either disease or injury, such as trauma to the tissue. And when I say regeneration, I mean we're trying to re-engineer tissues so they acquire their original form and function. So after injury, tissue repair usually occurs, and you get scar tissue formation, and scar tissue impairs the function of a tissue. And so we're trying to promote true regeneration of hair follicles and skin so that it is just like the native skin before it became diseased or injured. Most prominent questions that I get asked is, when will there be a cure for hair loss? And I think there will be a cure. I don't know when it will be, but a lot of research groups work on identifying therapeutics to impact one aspect of the hair follicle cycle, or they try to promote more cycling of the hair follicle. But a lot of these treatments is like shutting the barn door after the horse has bolted. And so I think if we can really understand the dynamics and the drivers of hair loss and understand why the follicle has stopped regenerating, which is such a natural thing for it to do, then we can actually move the field forward, and I think we will be able to identify treatments for hair loss. And it might not be a drug, it might be a cell therapy or a combination of different treatments. And I think the combination or the collaboration between researchers who are all investigating different aspects of the follicle is what will move us forward. So hopefully, there will be a cure for hair loss. I don't know when. So another question that I get is hair loss genetic, or is androgenetic alopecia genetic? And I guess that a clue is in the name. There is a genetic component to it, but it's not a normal Mendelian trait. Like, it's not passed from father to son or from mother to son necessarily. And that's one of the difficulties with researching this disease. There's not there's not a single gene that causes it. So we can't target that single gene. Obviously, the androgen receptor is involved, but that has only been shown to be involved in male pattern hair loss, and it hasn't been associated yet with female pattern hair loss. So there's obviously also differences in male and female pattern hair loss, yet they both come under the androgenetic alopecia banner. And so understanding the genetics and what variations in our genetics can contribute to this disease will help to identify treatments for androgenetic alopecia in men and in women. So another question that I often get asked, or maybe I don't get it asked so much, I like to tell people the answer to this question without being asked it, is what causes the pattern of hair loss? So I come from a developmental biology background, and actually in our skin, there are 2 different layers in our skin, the top layer, which is the epidermis, and an underlying layer known as the skin dermis. And all the tissue types in our body come from 3 cell origins during our embryonic development. And the epidermis, the top layer of our skin, comes from this origin known as the ectoderm all over our body. The epidermis all over our body comes from the ectoderm. Now, the skin dermis is kind of unique. From the sort of top of our head and down our back, the skin dermis comes from the mesoderm layer, and then from our sort of chin or neck down our front, the skin dermis comes from the mesoderm layer. And the face is really unique. The skin dermis on our face, from here to here, comes from the ectoderm. And it's one of the only tissue types in the body that has these 2 different origins. And we haven't made the association yet with the difference in origin and the pattern of hair loss in androgenetic alopecia, but there clearly is a link. Follicles on the face are androgen sensitive, so you either get a beard in response to androgens, or your hair follicles miniaturize on your occipital scalp in response to androgens, but it only occurs in that specific location where the dermis has an ectoderm origin. which I think is really interesting. So there's another interesting research project in my lab which is related to the pattern of hair loss, and in it we collaborated with the Fajo Clinic and we isolated hair follicles from the frontal scalp and the occipital scalp, and we performed this kind of genetic analysis on them to identify, well, we thought we were going to identify drivers of miniaturization on the frontal scalp, and we didn't actually identify any drivers of miniaturization, but we identified things that we think protect against miniaturization on the back of the scalp. So it's made us start thinking about androgenetic alopecia in a different way. I always used to think that the disease was driven by androgens, but now I'm starting to think about it as in this area of the scalp where you get miniaturization, there's just a loss of protection. So it's not protected from miniaturizing, whereas follicles on the occipital scalp seem to be protected because of their genetic makeup. So we're just trying to compile all the results and sort of make sense of the data at the moment, but I think that's quite interesting. It's given us a different perspective on the disease. So what do I mean by miniaturization? When hair follicles, or when you get hair loss, the follicle doesn't actually disappear, it just becomes dimensionally smaller. We get a smaller dermal papilla, which is a cell cluster at the base of the follicle, and associated with that, the hair fiber that is produced by the follicle also gets dimensionally smaller. And that process is known as miniaturization. I did natural science as a degree, which meant I combined many different subjects. I did chemistry and biology, even some archaeology and sociology. And one of my lecturers was a developmental biologist, and he gave these really inspiring lectures on skin development and the experiments that had been conducted in the 1970s that had led people to understand where the key signals in skin development came from. And I was like captivated at that moment. I only applied for a PhD in his laboratory. I went then and I conducted the PhD in his lab, and it just went from there. So I've been working on hair loss or the hair follicle since 2003. And all of my positions, my postdoc, my faculty position now, my lab has always worked on the hair follicle. I just find it really interesting, but it all stemmed from those lectures when I was an undergrad. When I get an idea in my head, I can't sleep. I just want to jot it down on paper and write a grant or conduct an experiment. I love my job. I love researching hair. I find it really inspiring because it has so many influences on all the different projects in my lab. Not everyone works on hair, but all the projects have been influenced by our knowledge of the hair follicle.